Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to the webinar today. This is the second webinar in our fall webinar series on communication and fire. My name is Carrie Berger and I'm the project coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. I'll be your moderator for today's session. To avoid any noise interference, I have muted your audio, so if you have a question, please type that into the chat box. I'll be recording the webinar today and we'll archive it, excuse me, and we'll archive it on our website and YouTube channel. You can find those web addresses listed in the chat box. I've also added a link to the paper that our guest will be referencing today in her presentation, and that can also be found in the chat box, along with the research brief that the consortium wrote on that particular paper. If you're short on time, reading our research briefs is a great way to get the main points out of a paper. Okay, so well, enough from me. We are very excited to have with us today Brandon Noel, who is a community psychologist and a professor in the School of Public and International Affairs at North Carolina State University. Branda, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, I think I am off mute now. Is that right?
That is correct.
Great. Thanks so much, and thank you everyone for joining in today. I know it's a Friday before a holiday. People are kind of prepping for the holidays next week, so I appreciate everyone's time and definitely appreciate Carrie and all of her efforts in helping to coordinate and facilitate making this webinar come to pass. It's really a pleasure to get to speak with the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. And I'm going to be talking today about some research that my colleague Toddy Steelman and I have been working on. It's sort of a program of research over the last 8 years. And this is some prior research that we had done that's really sort of fed into our current research program. And it's on communication both before and during large-scale wildfire incidents, and what we can learn about what things look like before a fire what we know about what things look like before a fire that can help us understand how things are likely to go during a fire. So with that, just a little bit of background. We situated this work within this context of capacity building as a means for resilience. And there's a lot of talk about capacity building and about resilient designs and how it is we build more resilient communities. This has been embedded within the National Cohesive Strategy work that's going on, and a lot of other efforts that are moving on to make communities more fire adapted and fire safe given the both social and ecological context in which they exist. And so the question is what kind of capacity building should we be focusing on? And there's a couple of different approaches. There's actually several different approaches out there. Two kind of big ones are what we might consider to be a bureaucratic approach. So this would be focusing a lot in terms of capacity building on planning and developing standard operating procedures, roles and responsibilities, mutual aid agreements, developing specialists and technologies. So these are really about building capacity in terms of plans, procedures, documented things, and tools that we can kind of put in place to help us respond more effectively during a large-scale wildfire event. And then a sort of complementary approach is what we would call a relational approach. And oftentimes these happen simultaneously, but the focus there on capacity building is on relationship building and trying to build social relationships that can be responsive and adaptive to unforeseen events that may take place. And so there's a focus within this relational approach on what's referred to oftentimes by scholars as network management. So I want to talk a little bit about what we mean, because we adopt a network perspective a lot in our work. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by a network and why we think a network perspective is an important perspective when we think about communities and land agencies and incident management teams and other federal response efforts in responding to a large-scale wildfire event. So we have used this concept of networks to describe all of the organizations, agencies, units, and groups who have some sort of formal sustained responsibility to respond to some aspect of the management of a large-scale wildfire incident. And generally, these become most prominent within the context of wildland-urban interface fire, where you have not only all of the complexities associated with a multi-jurisdictional fire in terms of coordinating and getting on the same page across all of the land agencies in the land management approach, but you also have emergency operations that are working in the problem domain as well. So they are working on evacuations and sheltering and mass care and communications associated with that, reentry of evacuated areas. All of those pieces also then come into play. And so if you think about all of those functional areas and all of the people that have sort of formal responsibilities to engage in operations within sort of the physical space together in response to a large-scale wildfire event, that can be a lot of different actors. And what we know about networks are several things. One, within a network, the people who are the first people that get information are not oftentimes the people who are necessarily need that information most critically. So we have what we call a distributed information problem, where information exists in one part of the network but is needed in another part of the network. We know that during these complex events, oftentimes, regardless of how much planning we do, unexpected things happen. And that oftentimes requires an adaptive response. So people need to come together and act in coordinated ways that maybe they didn't plan on having to do before. And so there wasn't time to put together a mutual aid agreement or some sort of memorandum of understanding about how to do that. So they need to be able to in real time, react and come together and engage in collective action without necessarily the benefit of a priori planning to be able to do that. And lastly, they need to make sure and not mess each other up. And this refers to the coordination aspects of it, when you have multiple different actors all having different management functions within the same physical space. There's a high level of risk for actions of one agency or organization to do something that then undermines or compromises the effectiveness of an operations in another area. And so making sure that we're staying sort of in lockstep and that there's information flowing around to make sure that people are not undermining each other's efforts and that coherently they're coming together. So we know that those are key challenges when you're working in a complex network type of environment, and those are the challenges that we need to manage. And we also know from some of Tati and I's past research and we think that this is probably one of the strongest calls for why we need better network management, is that when things go wrong in one part of an incident, it doesn't matter how well the particular domain that you have command and control and responsibility over well went. The community sees things going wrong in one part as reflective of failures in the overall incident. So we've had findings that suggest that, so for example, if everything goes beautifully and there's just amazing amounts of cooperation on some of the fire operations, but the reentry of evacuated areas gets screwed up, the community's still not happy. And that's some of the main constituents. And they're not happy with all of it. They don't necessarily distinguish the jurisdiction of not my job, that wasn't what I was supposed to be caring about. And so there's a strong reason for everyone to care about all aspects of what's going on in the network and try as much as possible to make sure the information is getting where it needs to go so that we don't undermine operations in any part of the network, while still obviously making sure everybody's sort of staying in their lane and keeping in coordination in that way. So this concept of network management that we've been working on for about a decade now within complex incidents to wildfire response really is about those things: getting information where it needs to go when it gets into one part of the network and it's needed in another, making sure that there are the abilities for the network to come together in an adaptive way if there's an opportunity for collective action to take place. And making sure that operations in one aspect of the network are not undermining operations in another aspect of the network. And we have a lot of descriptive information suggesting that pre-incident relationships are important to the management of an actual incident. So it's sort of become one of those things that we all think we know. It gets said a lot that pre-existing relationships and are an important piece of it. But there's actually limited work empirically examining the linkages between pre-incident networks and the during incident communications. And so that's what this project was seeking to bring a little bit more nuanced understanding to. And by the way, as I go through here, I'm really comfortable being fairly informal in presentations. So if there's questions as we're moving along, please feel free to interrupt, and I'd be happy to address them. So the research focus that I'm going to be talking with you about today was a study that we did where we were specifically asking the question, how to pre-incident familiarity, so familiarity between different responding stakeholders ahead of an incident, and their similarity influence the frequency and the quality of communications among and between incident management team members, local national forests, so our acronyms LNS just stands for the local national forest, and local cooperators. So this would be all other aspects, particularly in the emergency response areas. So sheriff and the county emergency managers, local governments, etc. So by similarity, we wanted to look at two things. We wanted to look at do people who do the same thing do it better, work better together than people who do different things, and people who represent sort of the same stakeholder group. So they're all local emergency response folks. And how does sort of those within group dynamics influence how things work during the fire? So the methods, this was a comparative case study of 3 wildland-urban interface wildfire events, one in New Mexico, one in Arizona, and one in California. It was a mixed method field study, so we were on site during these incidents and were able to conduct in-person interviews with the network of agency responders, which generally was about 30 to 40 folks, again, representing the incident management team, the local national forest, and the local cooperators. And we were looking at understanding their relationship, the relationships among this 30 to 40 actors in terms of how familiar they were with each other before the event, and then aspects of similarity. So were they part of, were they all, who were the IMT folks, who were the local cooperators, who were the local national forest, and their functional role, whether they were on evacuation road closures, on fire management, on public information, et cetera, and their past fire experience. And then we also looked at then their frequency of communication during the event and the quality of that communication at a dyadic level, so between any two stakeholders within that group. One of the things that was important is that we really wanted to make sure we had a comprehensive look of the whole network. So across all 3 of these, we had better than 80% of data from all of the responders in the network. So we had a pretty comprehensive look about how that incident went from a communications standpoint. And then we used some cross-nested HLM models that I'll explain in a little bit to do some of the quantitative modeling analysis. So just to give you a little bit of a picture of these fires, one was the Tecolote Fire in New Mexico. This was a fire that threatened the Las Vegas municipal watershed, and there was several structural threats. It was a fire that was in a ponderosa pine mixed conifer forest. There was the suppression approach was management approach was a full suppression perimeter control fire. It burned 812 acres and it cost about $5.5 million in San Miguel County. The second fire of this case study was the Schultz Fire in Arizona. This one threatened about 1,000 residents, 100 commercial buildings, and 500 outbuildings. There were evacuations in effect, and it closed up Highway 89. The Flagstaff municipal watershed was threatened. It was, again, a full suppression perimeter control fire, burned 15,000 acres at a cost of $8.5 million. And again, it was a mixed conifer with heavy dead and down. The last was the Bull Fire in California. This one was 1,200 residents threatened. Again, evacuations and road closures were in effect. There were 6 residents lost. It was a full suppression perimeter control, about 16,500 acres, cost of $6.3 million. It was near Lake Isabel, California. This was a little bit different fuel, 5-foot brush, grass, oak, and pine, and this one took place in Kern County, California. So those were our three cases. And so to start with, just to give a little bit of the network level analysis. So this is the big picture. How did things look at across all of the different stakeholders who were engaged in either the fire operations or the emergency response aspects of these networks? And so we asked about three things. We wanted to know how well these networks performed at communicating effectively, at integrating local context information into their response efforts, and at coordinating between the incident management team, the local national forest, and the cooperators. And as you can see, one point of explanation in interpreting these is that this was on we used a room for improvement scale. So we asked folks to rate how much room there was for improvement. So lower numbers are actually more positive, and that means there was less room for improvement. And so you can see across here, these fires received pretty high marks in interagency coordination and communication, accessibility of the IMT, and the IMT's utilization of local context information. So this purple bar up here represents sort of the average across all three fires, and each of these represents one of the fires, the green being the Bull, red being Schultz, and blue being Tecolote. But you can see the differences across these are fairly minimal. So all three of these fires were fairly similar to each other in some of these outcomes overall, and they tended to follow very similar patterns. So again, some of the most effective areas were around the coordination. They were perceived as being very effectively managed in terms of coordination between the local forest and the community agencies in the transition from the local forest to the IMT, and the coordination of the IMT to the local forest. So some really high marks in terms of coordination there. Or I'm sorry, I just said that backwards. These were the areas in which there was a little bit more problems than this scale always screws me up too. I need to, we're like, maybe in the future we should just reverse code all of these. So highest levels were on the accessibility of the IMT, coordination between the IMT and community agencies, and coordination between the IMT and local forest. A little more problems we saw in the coordination with the local forest and community agencies and transitions from the local forest to the IMT. All right, so that's kind of the network level overall incident look at what happened. And then we wanted to look at the extent to which pre-fire relationships mattered, and if they did, what they mattered for. So this was an important question for a couple of reasons. A lot of the work that we've been doing leading up to this project, and since this work has been on social watch-out situations and trying to understand how to prioritize, how to think about risk management of social risk for problematic communication and coordination to occur, and when and how to prioritize around that. And this came out of some early work that we did where we were presenting back to some Type 1 incident commanders, talking about their networks and about communication amongst them and how important that was. And one of the incident commanders came up to us afterwards like, yeah, this is great, it really resonates. However, one of the things that you could really help us with is that, any second that I'm doing this, I'm not doing something else. That incidents are complex. There's a lot of competing demands for time and attention and resources. And so you have to make some priorities and prioritization about what are the most important risks, what are the highest risks right now, and what do I need to be investing time and resources into. And so trying to understand where there's potential for problematic communication and coordination occurring can provide the basis for doing some of that prioritization of knowing if you're in what we've started to refer to as a social watch-out situation, in which there's a strong likelihood that there's going to be problems occurring if the situation isn't directly managed, which means that there's going to need to be some investment of time and resources put into managing that relationship. So by understanding how pre-fire relationships influence how things get structured and how effective they are during the fire, we can start to do some forecasting in terms of understanding where problems, if they occur, are most likely to occur, which is really important from a risk management kind of standpoint. So in order to do this, though, we needed to really understand from an empirical standpoint how much of an overlap there was between what things look like ahead of the fire and what things look like during the fire. So the first way that we looked at that was in understanding the centrality of the network of responders before the incident, and how that reflected their position within the network during the incident. So centrality essentially just reflects, it's a numerical calculation in a network analysis methodology, but it essentially just reflects who's the person that everybody else is talking to, right? It's the most popular kid on the playground, if you will. And so, and we have two different kinds of centrality that we looked at. One was just degree centrality, which again is just who's the one that everybody else is talking with overall. And then we also have betweenness centrality, which has to do with brokerage. And so brokerage means it's not necessarily the person who the most people are talking to, but it's the person who tends to bridge between the most disparate groups. So the person who has the most amount of ties bridging between, so for example, the incident management team and the local national forest. Who are the people that are serving as that sort of communication hub between two disparate groups? So those are very important positions, because if you think about it from an operations standpoint and a strategic standpoint, if you need to get information out to the most amount of people quickly, or you need to be able to get to somebody that get information from point A to point B very quickly, knowing degree centrality is really important, because it oftentimes that's the person who's the easiest person to go to. If you only have time to talk to one person, that's probably the person you want to target. Betweenness centrality is also very important, because it's one of our biggest challenges on incident response is trying to get information to flow between across agency lines, between functional areas. People kind of stick to their own a little bit. There's a birds of a feather effect that happens on incidents. And so betweenness folks, brokers, are the people who can bridge between those otherwise in what can become isolated groups. So knowing who those bridgers are is also very important. What we found is that there is a fairly significant correlation between how central you are in the pre-fire network and how central you are in communications during the fire, particularly in terms of degree centrality. So the people who were the center everybody knew ahead of the fire are the people that everyone talked to during the fire, and that was an important validation of that. And the people who were brokers before the fire also tended to be brokers during the fire. So that's important, because if we know who those people are ahead of the fire, we can do some predictions about how that network is likely to structure itself during a significant incident. One of the things that, as we're doing our interviews and collecting this data, the importance of pre-fire relationships in facilitating communication coordination was highlighted repeatedly. People talked a lot about the importance of knowing people ahead of time, knowing people through different capacities. The fire community tends to be a fairly insular group in lots of ways. People come up through it, starting as field crews back in college, and kind of move their way up and sort of stay in those communities. So people have a lot of history with each other in this community, and folks talked a lot about that as being something that was important for their ability to manage when a significant event was happening in their community. So when we think about these three incidents and what are some of the things that might have helped make them be so effective, one of the things that characterized these three incidents strongly is that the incident management teams were working within their own regions. And so these incident management teams, even though they were Type 1 federal incident management teams, they had significant history. So this graph that you see here is a network map. For those of you who are not familiar with them, the blue dots represent the local cooperators, green dots represent the local national forest, and red dots represent the incident management team. And these dots reflect how connected the incident management team was to the rest of the local network before the fire even ever happened. So, that became sort of a significant thing that we started to look at. And then we looked at that across all of the three fires. And what we found is there's lots and lots of pre-fire linkages that existed between the incident management team members and the local communities that they were serving. And again, this came out in our field work as being something that gave them a lot of flexibility and advantage in being able to navigate those networks effectively. And this was important, particularly because when we did this research, there was some work that was happening at the time to do away with some of the regionality associated with team assignments, and thinking about teams from a much more national perspective, to allow some more flexibility in that. And so it was informative in terms of thinking through what might be some of the limitations to that model, that if teams are coming in from outside the area and don't have this level of connectivity with the local forest and the local cooperators, that they're at a disadvantage relative to teams that do have those kinds of connections. All right, so the last level, sort of phase of this analysis on this project was really exploring variation at the dyadic level. So what we mean by that is essentially trying to predict and understand relationships between any two particular stakeholders that were in the network. So trying to predict what predicts the likelihood that this stakeholder is going to communicate with this stakeholder, and what predicts the likelihood that this communication linkage is going to go well or is going to be problematic. So trying to understand and predict things at this dyadic level. And I went ahead and included some of the tables that are associated with the analysis on this. And I did this in part because I get to work a lot with a lot of biophysical scientists, and it's been really fun to sort of learn the differences in how we ask and answer questions. And I know social science research, particularly quantitative social science research, is somewhat of an unfamiliarity to a lot of folks. And so I wanted to include some of the data tables on this, just to give you a little bit, let everybody kind of look under the hood about how we come to these findings and conclusions that we do. So again, the question that we were asking here is what predicts the frequency and the quality of communication between stakeholders during an incident? And we looked at three factors: how familiar the stakeholders were with each other before an incident. Did they have a pre-existing relationship? How similarity in terms of having a similar stakeholder affiliation, and similarity instead of role, in terms of role, excuse me. So our conceptual model was this, that stronger pre-existing relationships, role similarity, and stakeholder group similarity would improve communication effectiveness, so have lower room for improvement in communication, and increase the frequency of communication. So we should be able to explain what things look like in terms of who communicates with who during a fire if we know something about what the communication network looked like before the fire, and we should be able to explain something about how well those communications are likely to go. So here's some of the data tables on that, and the ones I want to point your attention to is these t-values. So this is the significance testing that we did at each of these hypotheses. And so what this table communicates is essentially that all three of our predictor variables, familiarity, role similarity, and stakeholder similarity, are positively related to communication frequency. So each of these increases the likelihood that two responders are likely to interact with each other during an incident. And you can also see the t-values reflect, in terms of size, a relative notion of effect. And so you can see in terms of the strength of the effect, we see a very strong effect associated with familiarity relative to role similarity and stakeholder similarity. So what this tells us is that if you can only understand one thing ahead of a fire to try and understand how the communications are likely to look like in terms of who communicates with who during a fire, the thing you want to know is who knows each other ahead of the fire. This next table looked at communication effectiveness. So we asked for every single dyadic pair. So we asked the sheriff, how did things go with the district ranger? We asked the district ranger, how did things go with the sheriff? So we wanted to be able to predict how well things went at this dyadic level. And so what we find here, remember again, this is on a room for improvement scale. So low numbers are less problematic communication, high numbers are more problematic communication. And so what we find here is that role similarity and stakeholder group similarity have no effect, but that communication frequency during the fire is basically the more stakeholders communicated with each other during the fire, the more likely they were to report that those communications went well and that they were effective. And also, the more that they knew each other, the stronger their relationship was before the fire, the more likely they were to report that those communications went well. All right. And then the last thing that we wanted to look at was an interaction effect to see whether or not there was an interaction between familiarity and stakeholder similarity. And indeed, we did find that. And so oftentimes our interaction effects are the easiest to understand if you graph them. And so essentially what we found here was that in terms of understanding who was most room for, had the most room for improvement, it was people who had low familiarity and were different. So nothing particularly unusual there. The least room for improvement came of people who are at high familiarity and were the same. Again, nothing surprising there. But what was somewhat interesting is the fact that people with low familiarity who were the same tended to do better than people who had high familiarity who were the same. And that was somewhat of an interesting thing. So it led us to the question that if before this fire, you were of a similar group, but you didn't know each other, you were more problematic in your communications during the fire than if you didn't, than if you did know each other. I'm sorry, I'm going to say that one more time. If you were of, basically, if you were of the same stakeholder group, but you didn't know each other, that was going to be your most problematic than if you actually did know each other. And we did a lot of thinking about this in terms of why this might be. And we think that essentially what this suggests is that there may be some effect that's happening where people who are the same, they represent the same stakeholder group, they tend to take some things for granted in terms of what other people who are like them know and do, and so they may be a little less careful and cautious in their communication work. So in terms of explaining this, so does lack of similarity increase or decrease the risk for problematic communication? Well, it depends. So for pairs lacking a pre-incident relationship, those within the same stakeholder group indicated that more problematic communication relative to communications and diets that were from different stakeholder groups. So again, perceived similarity may lead to assumptions and reduce conscientiousness in good communication practices. Or maybe there's just higher expectations of those within their own stakeholder groups about how those communications could go. So this is something we're still working on kind of teasing out in terms of what it means. Does lack of similarity increase or decrease the risk for problematic communication? Well, for those with stronger pre-incident relationships, similarity was associated with improved communication effectiveness. So common experiences and identity tends to magnify relation-based trust. So what are some of the implications of this? I mean, one, we think that it brings empirical evidence to a general speculation about how pre-disaster relationships matter, and provides a little bit more nuanced understanding of it. It suggests that responders interact the most with who they know, regardless of their functional role or stakeholder affiliation, and that pre-incident relationships are going to shape the during incident communication. So if we know what the network looks like ahead of the fire, we have a pretty good predictor of understanding who's going to be talking to who during the fire. And that both familiarity and frequent interaction significantly improve communication during an incident. So this provides a foundation for thinking about sort of the relative importance of different relational capacities and their interactions with each other. And so the inverse of this would say, if you know ahead of a fire that there is a big gap in communication between a set of stakeholders, you can almost bet that gap is going to maintain itself during the fire, and that would suggest a social watchout situation that is probably going to need to be managed in order for it to, in order to manage the risk for problematic communication and coordination to occur. So again, this research happened a couple years ago, and since then we've built on this in trying to sort of leverage these findings for thinking about these social watchout situations. Publication that Toddy and I put out in Wildfire Today, I think a couple months ago it came out, that you can look up, it relates to what some of these social watchout situations are. in terms of things that would cue incident responders that there is a likelihood for problematic communication and coordination to occur. And sorry, this thing just popped up. And we're also working on several projects right now related to this notion of network management. So if we know that we're in a network in which there is higher risk for problematic communication and coordination to occur, how is it that we manage effectively within that context? So how do we operationally engage with folks that are outside of our command and control? How do we co-manage across all of the different stakeholder groups? We are working right now on what is one of the first longitudinal studies of community capacity and how it's impacting co-management on fires. And we're working a lot on trying to think through some of and identify some of the innovations in co-management and network governance that are taking place. And then the last thing that we're working on a lot is cognitive alignment. So the notions of the role of social cognition among responders and how that influences both their perception of risk as an element of resilience, as well as how that influences how they interact with one another. So I'd like to encourage you to visit our website, www.firechasers.ncsu.edu. All of our reports and manuscripts are posted up there when we have the copyright ability to do so, and are available for download. And if there's anything not up there that you would like to read, please just contact us directly. We're happy to send you anything. So with that, special thanks to our research team and also our funders, the Joint Fire Science Program and the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station. And I would love to hear any thoughts, reactions, questions, comments that you might have. And I guess with that, Carrie, I will mute myself. Oh dear, okay. I think we lost Carrie. That's what it sounds like. So, and I have no idea how to work this system. Janine, do you know how to moderate questions that are coming in? Okay, so a couple questions are coming in a chat box here. So I will, until we get somebody more capable, able to do it, I'll try and just moderate it myself. So one question that came in was, what are some strategies for building familiarity before the fire if it does not exist? Beer parties. It's a great question. You know, we are looking, there's a lot of innovative things that are happening. The usual suspects approaches that folks tend to use are sand table exercises, planning exercises. A lot of this work happens in the development of wildfire protection plans that communities undertake. In terms of, so I think in terms of linking together the local national forest and the local cooperators, those are really critical opportunities for outreach. In terms of the incident management teams, I don't actually think that that's something we probably can do because of how just the teams get, you know, the notion of the dynamics associated with the rotation schedule. And so it's hard to know which teams are going to show up in which communities. I do understand that they are continuing to keep the regional rotation schedule to try and keep teams operating within their region when they can. But when it comes to specifically type 1 teams, I think just recognizing that we're in a heightened network management situation when you're dealing with a team that has no pre-existing relationships is something that we're still needing to work through. I'm curious if other folks have had experiences with some other innovations in terms of building those relationships between local cooperators and with the local national forest and other land management agencies. I'm not sure if folks are able to communicate in on this. Again, I'm not super familiar with the WebEx system. Are there any other questions or comments that folks might have? Okay, questions came in. Although familiarity was measured pre-fire, was the quality of relationship thought to make a difference when it comes to the communication effectiveness? So that's a great question. We did not ask about how the valence, if you will, that how positive or negative the relationship was. We only asked about how familiar people were with each other. And so I think that's a great question, that you could be very familiar, but it could be a negative relationship. The overall trend of our findings was that regardless of the valence, that if you just knew each other, that improved the effectiveness during the incident. And there's other social psychological research out there about that essentially familiarity leads to predictability. So even if it's not a great relationship, at least it's the devil you know. I know how to manage you in our relationship together. I know things that are likely to make it more effective and less effective. Whereas if I don't know you, it can be a little bit more problematic. So, but I think it's a great question, something that we should look at.
Branda, this is Carrie. I'm back online.
Hey.
I'm really sorry about that. I don't know what happened, but I figured it out, and here I am. So thank you for covering yourself. I'm not sure if you've covered all the questions. Are there any other questions for Branda? Okay. Well, Branda, I do apologize. I missed the last bit of your presentation, but what I had heard was fantastic. And I just want to thank you again for taking the time with us today, and also everybody else for taking the time out of their busy schedules to listen in today. As I've said before, the Northwest Fire Science Consortium tries to offer a diversity of opportunities for people to participate in, and hosting webinars is just one way we can accomplish that. So just going to check here to see if anybody else has written anything, but I don't see anything. Branda, are you seeing anything on your end?
I am not. Nope.
Okay.
But thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And then also, I just want to say too, if anybody else has an interesting idea for a webinar, please don't hesitate to get a hold of us. And we do have a webinar that's coming up on December 7th at 10 a.m. We'll be hosting categorizing the social context of the wild and urban interface, adaptive capacity for wildfire and community archetypes. And that information is listed in your chat box. So if there are no other questions, again, a big thank you to you, Branda. And we hope, yes, we hope that you'll all join us again in the future. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.